Um, all right, I want to talk to you all a bit about kind of a really interesting chapter in New York history, which is how we got to the war on drugs here. You might ask, why New York? New York, in fact, was the first state to pass mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which, if you don't know what these are basically codes, judicial codes, that mandate that if a defendant shows up in a courtroom under a drug charge and is found guilty, then they have to receive, mandatory, a certain minimum sentence. In 1973, when what is now called the Rockefeller drug laws were passed, this was in May of 1973, there were sentences as high, the highest mandatory minimum was 15 or 25 to life, which essentially meant that your minimum was 15, and you might be eligible for parole if you had served all of that first. And you might not ever get parole, meaning you stay there for the rest of your natural days. Just side note, what we know about New York State system, this is some other work that I did about a year or two ago. I was part of an effort campaigned for the release of aging people in New York State prisons. And we released a report last November, it was, about the condition of aging people. A lot of them were under Rockefeller laws. A lot of them were there for other things as well, but some of them, quite a few were there for drug crimes. One thing that we know about New York State, and I don't think New York State's much different from many of the other 49 states, is that parole boards are not exactly generous. All right, in New York you go up, I think, every 2 years for parole, and it's no big thing to just get shot down each time. I have a friend who went, I think, a total of, I think he did like a dozen parole appearances, did a total of 33 years. And really, he was no more rehabilitated at the end of those 33 years than he had been some 15 or 20 years before that. He was the same person. He had gotten like 3 master's degrees, was a peer educator in HIV prevention I forget what prison he was in. And he just kept going up and they just kept hitting him down. And then one day they let him loose. To this day, he doesn't know why they let him loose. He's like, I'm no different today than they should have let me go 18 years ago. I've done nothing. All my rehabilitation was done the first 15 years. I knew what I did wrong. And I'm the same guy that I was, that time. So that's a bit of a side note. What I'll also say is that the entire system's messed up, I guess, is the short academic terminology. And because we're videotaping, I'm going to say messed up instead of some other words which, on a more candid moment, you would find me using very vocally and probably profusely. I want to talk a bit about how all this began. I want to talk about the Rockefeller drug laws. By the way, you heard the musical stylings, if you haven't figured out by now, of Mr. James Brown, Godfather of Soul. That was a kind of PSA, public service announcement record he released in 1972 called King Heroin. Yeah, I have this kind of side hobby of I try to find songs about drugs, particularly heroin. There aren't that many good ones out there. And I'm sorry, this one included. That's not you have the lyrics in front of you. I didn't print those out for you so you could admire the kind of poetry of it. It's like a pretty heavy-handed song, right? The idea is that if you just even so much as look at heroin, you could end up being its slave for the rest of your natural days. It's another sidebar, but I want to say that's not true. All right? We've had lots of drug scares. I'm not saying, this is not Samuel Roberts saying you should all go out and pick up a bag and play around with it. But I'm also not at all saying that if you did, that would be the kind of end of your life right there, that you'd be hooked. That's really, it's a drug scare. They said the same thing. Well, they said the same thing about crack cocaine, right? 80s and 90s. Anybody here remember that? Anybody my age grew up in that time, right? I was scared to death of crack cocaine, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, there are some bad things about that, because fear and knowledge are actually two very different things, right? One should be knowledgeable about the pharmaceutical and chemical landscape out there, but to be fearful of it actually can have you making dumb decisions. Luckily, I wasn't old enough to vote back then. Who knows? I might have been so afraid of crack cocaine that my local politician could have convinced me to vote for mandatory sentences for crack possession. Luckily, I wasn't old enough to vote, right? I was just old enough to just say no, as Nancy told us to do. Which, you know, is, I've been known to have bad judgment in my youth. I might should write Nancy a letter and tell her that might be the one good thing she did for at least me. I got to remember that I'm on video here. I shouldn't be saying too much about Fancy Nancy. But yeah, that's, you will find all sorts of examples of drug scares in American history. Crack cocaine. They said about marijuana, reefer madness. Now, I mean, you know, you watch that movie and listen to, you know, read some of the literature from that period, you would think if you just looked at marijuana, you'd be hooked forever. I mean, I think we all know people that shows that is not really true. Now, we all know that one person who just seems they can't leave it alone. That might be something else. It just might be you just don't want to move out your mama's basement. I don't know. But in all seriousness, I think if of all the drugs that are supposed to be dangerous ones, and marijuana is like, you know, it's high up there. It's like right up there with heroin in terms of government, federal, like scheduling. The federal government officially regards it to be as dangerous as any of the opioids out there. And I think even those of us who are completely straight edge, don't drink, don't smoke, can probably agree that's probably not the case, though, right? They said it about marijuana. They said it about, I mean, you know, they said about alcohol. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people said about alcohol. That's how we got the Prohibition movement that ended in 1933. We seem to get this. Oh, we had about meth. Remember meth a few years ago? There was literally, it might still be there. It's literally a website called, I think it said, "Don't try it even once," or "notevenonce.com." .org, .edu, or something like that. Supposedly, .net. Supposedly, if you even just tried meth once, you'd be meth mouth and tweaked out on the corner. You would have sold everything with a cable attached to it just after one hit. These are the kind of mythologies that we get. That's so. I don't know why James Brown decided to record that. I guess I'm not. You know, it's not his fault. A lot of people did. If you ever look up some of these other songs, there aren't that many good ones. They're all very, like, shall we say, unnuanced, just like this one here. And if you just feel like abusing yourself, just Google and start listening to them. Your ears will start to bleed after a while. This is all to say that by the early 1970s, the United States was in yet another drug scare, a moral panic. On the 3rd of January of 1973, probably. Governor Nelson Rockefeller announced his frustration with what he viewed as 7 years of failed anti-drug efforts. And before the state legislature, this is his annual State of the State address, he says, "It is time for brutal honesty regarding narcotics addiction. In this state, we have allotted over $1 billion to every form of education against drugs and treatment of the addict through commitment," which is to say commitment, locking people away for forcible treatment, "through commitment, therapy, and rehabilitation. But let's be frank. Let's tell it like it is." And tell it like it is was one of those phrases like, today we'd say maybe keeping it real, but in the 70s you'd say, "I'm going to tell it like it is." So this is Rockefeller doing some sort of mock. Back then they called it jive. It was the lingo they called it, speaking jive. So I think that's what one of his advisors told him. If you want to really appeal to the Negroes of the state, you should use the phrase, "tell it like it is." And he said, "Okay." But I digress. Let's be frank. Let's tell it like it is. We have achieved very little permanent rehabilitation and have found no cure. The hard drug pusher destroys life just as surely and far more cruelly than a cold-blooded killer. He threatens our society as a whole, whether he engages in large-scale traffic or small-time operations. a lot of things that I want you to pay attention to in that phrase, right? First of all is that he's basically saying that large-scale pushers or small-time users should all get the same penalty, right? Other thing that you might not have picked up on that is that we found no cure. It's really interesting, right? It's born of a kind of naivete, what I would call a kind of high political modernism. There was this period in American history where we thought just if we just put our minds to it, put enough money to it, put enough weapons and military might to it, we could do anything, right? A few things showed us. I mean, this is kind of like, if we could put a man on the moon, why can't we do X? I'm sure you all have like an older relative that uses that phrase a lot. Why can't my omelet come out on time? If we could put a man on the moon, why am I still? I ordered food 30 minutes ago. Maybe it's just my old relatives that say stuff like that. But it's a high political modernism thing that you could just vanquish anything. Just if you just put enough money, resources, the best and the brightest, like I said. Increasingly, United States trajectory, the trajectory of United States history is if you just put enough guns and military might towards it, you can bend the world to your will. And why not think that, right? In the 1940s, we discovered, I mean, we meaning humankind, not the United States, penicillin. You think of all the diseases that would lay low any individual or a family or even an entire village. You know, a lot of those were vanquished, not eradicated, but certainly not as threatening as they used to be by, say, 1950. Tuberculosis, #1 killer of African Americans in cities for a number of years before 1940 or 1950, just to name one example. Why not think that we could conquer anything, including something as intractable as addiction? We should be able to find a cure, right? So he says, after $1 billion and 7 years of trying, sounds really naive now, right? It's like, I gave it 7 years and $1 billion, why can't I cure addiction? No, that's not how it works, right? It's high political modernism. I'm going to talk a bit about that, about the politics of ethnicity, what others would call the politics of race. I might say something along the way about why I prefer to say ethnicity as opposed to race. The short story is that if you don't believe in the reality of race, meaning the biological reality of race, not the social reality. We all know the social, I mean, you all would justifiably throw Rotten Tomatoes at me if I say there's no social reality to race. But the biological reality, if you do not believe in that, then I would challenge you to think of a different type of language than using that word, right? You can be creative. So that's just my little soapbox there. So the politics of ethnicity, or what others might call race, or color. I want to talk about conservative reaction to the civil rights and black power movements. I want to talk about how all of this led to the era today of what we call mass incarceration. All right? Please feel free to put a hand up along the way if I start going into directions that, well, you just feel like I've just gone way too far afield and you can't see me over the horizon, so you want to pull me back in or ask me some questions. Please feel free to do that. Sometimes I go on tangents, is what I'm trying to tell you. It's a warning. I've tried to structure this lecture with an eye towards what most of you all do in your day-to-day professional work, which is instructing the public. Be they students, university, undergrad, graduate, or high school, or museum work, or as artists, storytellers, as public speakers. I've tried to structure this lecture and the materials I've provided you in such a way that they will be useful to you if you wanted to replicate this lecture or elements of it. It's very common for a researcher to tell you that what she or he does is the most important thing in the world. In my case, it's true. Which is why it's imperative that all of you have these materials so you can spread the good news or the bad news about why drug laws might be the most detrimental thing to black public health since we vanquished tuberculosis. If African American public health was informed and shaped, impacted by diseases such as primarily tuberculosis, but there were a raft of others as well, in the period of infectious disease, say high mortality, in the era of the antimicrobial revolution, which is to say, antibacterials, penicillin, etc., all the cillins, amoxicillin, penicillin, all of those. One of the most dangerous, well, let's say, I would say politically one of the most detrimental might have been the drug laws, politically and public health. Notice I did not say drug use itself has been the crisis. I think in a lot of ways that's overblown. I mean, we all know people, we wish they'd use a little bit less than they do, but I would argue in the aggregate it's probably not as much as what the drug laws have done to our communities. People with simple possession, or with maybe possession of more than just a simple amount, who are put away, and then now families are torn apart. Expropriation of wealth. You put somebody away for a long time, they're no longer, they bring in no more income into their family or their community. It's a large stress on families and communities as well. Drug laws themselves might be, I would argue, I'm not being just polemical here, but I'm just a little bit polemical, might be the most challenging aspect, or the largest challenge to black public health of the post-World War II era. All right, so like I said, I've structured my comments with an eye towards if you were to replicate all or some element of this lecture yourself. Boy, this is a really big screen. I'm not sure I can see all of it. So these are in some part, yes, our learning objectives, but also I'd encourage you to think of these if you were to talk about this with your students. So thinking about a familiarity with the early chapter of the history of the U.S. war on drugs, identifying racial effects of the war on drugs. There, I slipped up, I used that word racial right there, but yeah, there it is. Specifically the Rockefeller drug laws, ability to consider the war on drugs as a major contributor, initiator of the era of mass incarceration. Talk a bit about that. Considering the war on drugs in the era of mass incarceration, historical context, and in relationship to the earlier period of civil rights and black power. And then also an ability to consider historically, I shouldn't say about that, the ability to consider historically the relationship between the social categories of quote-unquote addict, criminal, and citizen, and how these were inflected by discussions of ethnic politics. Okay, any questions about those? We might even put a few more up there as we move along. There we go. A few key terms. War on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences versus judicial discretion, criminalization, decriminalization, medicalization, Rockefeller drug laws, moral panic, and the silent majority. There might be a few others that we pick up along the way, but those are the main ones. Were you to teach this to a group of, say, advanced high school students or undergraduates, I would recommend that you maybe start with these. But like I said, we could add more along the way. This whole thing, I guess, is what I'm saying, is more like a suggested recipe. Like, Epicurious fans around here? Great website. The people, you can just add in, like you can, no one cooks in this room? Epicurious.com is great. And you just take the recipe and you can kind of switch it around as you like, It's going to be a long week, isn't it? I've got discussion questions here, which you can similarly tweak as you like. These are for students. Identifying racial effects of the war on drugs. Arguments describing the role of black politics in the emergence of the Rockefeller drug laws. I assigned 2 articles, one by Jalili Kohler-Hausman, the other by Michael Javen Fortner. In a lot of ways, they are at direct odds with one another. The former, the latter has made an argument in that article and in a book that the origin of the Rockefeller drug laws is actually within black politics. Jalili Kohler-Hausman makes a different argument, in a way a little bit more traditional, but one that I still find more convincing, which is that this was a way, drug laws themselves, Rockefeller drug laws in particular, but also you see these emerging in state after state, I think the rest of the 49 for the most part, over the few years after 1973. And Jalili's making an argument that this is actually a new form of conservative, moderate to conservative politics. If one were to think of government function during and after the New Deal, as being one in which the federal government is there to secure labor rights, income rights. We had some housing, housing construction. By this way, when I say it's there to secure and provide, clearly this does not fall equally upon all citizens, all right? You would rightfully throw rotten tomatoes at me if I were to make that assertion that all people were treated fairly under the New Deal or under, what's today, July the 11th? Yeah, today, all right? But I'm saying in theory, what the federal government would have done. This is governance, you might say, by rights of democratic vote and also an industrial democracy, ability to join labor unions, ability to have good housing, access to education, where these would be things where people can have sustainable families. That changes after about 1968. Increasingly, we enter a period which political scientist Jonathan Simon calls a period of governing through crime. Fewer or less and less frequently do you see citizens making claims on the state based upon, I'm a worker, I worked in the factory, my family moved from the South, came to the factory. There's white and black people. It's not just black people who moved from the South to work in factories. And I pay taxes, et cetera, and for those reasons I have rights. Increasingly, you start to see a language, a political discourse, if I may, of victimization. What about the victims of crime? Don't they have rights? Or the potential victims of crime. We need to make sure we lock people away so they don't victimize people again and again. We had the whole 1980s and 1990s scare over child abductions. Turns out that not nearly as bad as it made out to be. Yeah, we got all kinds of Megan's Law, Amber Alerts, and all that. Lots of people who, with who were listed as sex offenders who did their time are continuing to pay to this day, right? Not a popular group to think about. Right? So I think some of you are looking at me like, is he advocating for? Yeah, I am. Right? We're looking at a mode. We have to think historically here. Right? This is a mode of governance. We've increasingly been in a mode of fear and thinking of ourselves as victims, and our access to rights being our victimhood, or potential victimhood. And that's part of this is kind of the meta argument. Jonathan Simon is the political scientist that I mentioned. And that is also another researcher by the name of David Garland, who's a little bit more transatlantic. He compares the UK and the United States on their similar trajectories towards hyper-policing. All right. Am I being somewhat clear right now? Yeah? Okay. Another unpopular group, of course, were the junkies. That word, of course, gets scare quotes around it. All right? You would rightfully throw rotten tomatoes at me if I just kind of walked down the street and just said junkies. It's pejorative. Yeah, but that was the language that was used back then and continues to this day. All right, so that's a bit of my preamble right there. Do we talk about all the discussion questions? You might want to talk to your students about what, in their opinion, would be the relative merits and pitfalls of drug decriminalization. All right, that's something we might talk about as well. What does Kohler-Hausman mean when she describes the move in public policy to regard addicts as anti-citizens, the opposite of right-bearing citizens? That alludes to what I said earlier alludes to this question here, right? How do you, what are the various tiers on which citizenship is conferred upon people? Race and gender and sexual identity, of course, are some of those. One's condition as a quote-unquote addict / criminal, there's all kinds of ways in which our citizen rights are truncated on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute basis, all right? So this might be worth discussing with your students as well. And then the final one, I've kind of moved around here. Mass incarceration, criminal justice are under public criticism and scrutiny today in ways virtually unimaginable 20, 30, or even 40 years ago. What does that mean for drug policy? If we locked up so many people over the past 40 years on drug laws, as many as 50%, by the way, at the height of mass incarceration in the early 2000s, kind of peaked around 2007 or so. Notice that was around the time the recession hit, too. As many as 50% of people in prisons were in there for some sort of drug charge, nationally. Similar to New York State as well. All right, so I'm actually gonna, I will give you all copies of these slides. This is a 15-minute documentary about the Rockefeller drug laws, which we may come back to, but I'd rather not spend time. It's like 15 minutes, so we may come back to that as well. I'll cover a lot of what's in it. That's another one too, inshallah. All right, so I read you this quote here. I just love this picture of Rocky here, Nelson Rockefeller. This looks like, this is what I always imagined like Big Brother would look like. And like, you know, there is a screen adaptation of 1984, which is actually pretty good. As the picture looks, it's the same kind of scowl right there that he's given. So what are the Rockefeller drug? Let me actually move to the next slide too. And he says, a rising percentage of our high school and college students from every background and economic level have become involved, whether as victims or pushers of both. The crime, the muggings, the robberies, the murders associated with addiction continue to spread a reign of terror. Whole neighborhoods have been as effectively destroyed by addicts as by an invading army. We have this choice. Either we can go on as we have been with little real hope of changing the present trend, or must take those stern measures that I have become convinced common sense demands. Nelson Rockefeller's 15th annual State of the United States address. All right. So let's talk about what the Rockefeller drug laws actually were. All right. We'll get to that slide in a minute. They refer principally to Article 220 of the New York State Penal Law, pertaining to the possession or sale of so-called narcotic drugs. The designation narcotic actually isn't really that truthful in there. Narcotics, strictly speaking, are really as a chemical class with depressants, even though we put cocaine as we typically, for jurisprudential reasons, not pharmacological ones, label cocaine a narcotic. It's in fact it's a very powerful stimulant. That said, of course, it pertains to narcotic drugs. The law, of course, was named after Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who signed the bill on May 8, 1973. He proposed those strict measures, as I said, on January 3, 1973. There's a second component of the Rockefeller drug laws, which is called the Second Felony Offender Laws, which were also passed in 1973, which mandated longer prison sentences for felony offenders arrested within 10 years of their most recent felony offense. All right? There's two different sets. Well, not two different sets of, marijuana was, by the way, also included as a narcotic drug. It was repealed, taken out of the Rockefeller drug laws in 1979, largely because you had a lot of white middle-class parents saying, whoa, 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 my kid smokes weed. Like this, I thought you said you're going after like heroin. More importantly, junkies, who of course are not white. So leave the marijuana and my kid alone. So Governor Hugh Carey pulls that out of there in 1979, leaving all the other, for the most part, all the other drugs. All right, so the original proposal, like I said, as I mentioned earlier, Rockefeller's earlier proposal basically would have done mandatory minimum sentences, up to life for even simple possession, no matter how small the amount. The rationale of this was that drug use itself is a contagion. And if you want to break the chain of contagion, you've got to remove that person from society. This is literally the language that was used. You read a piece that I wrote about the kind of the misuses and abuses of epidemic language and epidemiology and plague narratives. This is a classic misuse of epidemic theory here, saying that it's a contagion where if you just remove the person, quarantine them indefinitely for the rest of their lives, then you've somehow fought addiction. That's not really how it works. And there's lots of evidence, as I made clear in some of these other articles, to show that was not the case. But Rockefeller would not be stopped. There was also, he also wanted no parole for anyone unless you were under the age of 19. And even those under 19 would still have to serve mandatory, would have to serve 15 years time served, rather, before they're eligible for parole. So you'd be 17, 18 years old for a small amount of whatever, even marijuana according to his initial proposal, and get 15 years before you could be considered for parole. This is Rockefeller's initial proposal. And he said anyone convicted of a violent crime within 48 hours of having consumed drugs would get harsher penalties as well. So say you get arrested and convicted for forcible robbery, right? Strong arm robbery, let's say strong arm robbery, right? No weapons involved, just strong arm. And if they determine that you had used a drug within 48 hours before that, your penalties can, double right there. All right? Rocky thought he was not messing around. He was completely poorly informed. I mean, even conservatives in the legislature and even law enforcement officials in New York State said, well, that's absolutely, it's inhumane, first of all. It's also not even practicable. Like, where are you going to lock all these people up? So the District Attorneys Association was one that complained, not the state corrections commissioner, but the city, New York City's corrections commissioner, said, no, I can't, this makes no sense at all. Like, people that you would normally not think of as being bleeding heart liberals even said, let's kind of get things in perspective here. I'm going a little bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about some of the effects. Oh, so eventually when it's passed, and so there was 4 months of negotiation, it was passed and certain things were taken out of the original proposal. Minimums range from 8 1/3 year for sale of small quantities to 15 a life for larger. Lifetime paroles available after mandatory minimum time has been served. But you're still paying, you're still serving time. Parole is just endless punishment. Like, I mean, it's real easy to violate parole. Show up late to your parole officer's office, and he or she's having a bad day. You could be violated for that. In some places, any kind of interaction with police can be considered a violation. Right? Like, it's real easy to get violated on, for your parole. So this lifetime supervision like that's not, I would not call that freedom. It may not be incarceration, but that doesn't mean it's freedom. And this last measure was dropped completely. We had some reforms in 2001. Putatively refocused police attention on large-scale drug dealers, but in reality it did not do much. 2004 and 5, the state legislature removed life sentences for non-violent drug offenses. Keep in mind, that's 30 years after the law's been passed. Only in 2004 and 5 did we say, well, if it was a non-violent drug offense, we really have to lock them up for life. That's on this side of the 21st century, what I'm trying to tell you. Like, that's like some straight 19th century way of thinking that was not distilled into the 21st. And then in 2009, some 7 years ago, the state legislature passed actual real reform. It's a myth that the Rockefeller drug laws have been repealed, but they have been reformed to the extent that they are not doing nearly the damage that they were doing, say, 15 or 30 years ago. Okay? All right, let's talk about some effects of the Rockefeller drug laws. By the end of the 20th century, the structural inequities of New York State's drug laws were more than apparent. Between 1973 and early 2000s, drug law arrests accounted for an ever-growing proportion of total arrests. 11%, I was about to ask you who wants to guess how many, but then I just realized I think I wrote it up. Yeah, it was, oh, maybe I didn't. Well, it was 11% in 1973. 11% of all arrests in 1973 were drug arrests. Throughout the 1990s, it never got below 45% of all arrests. So let's just call it half. Yet most of the convictions were not the result of actual court trials. Defendants were usually presented with one of two choices, trial or plea bargain. All right? There's a lot of things that there's a phrase that we use called perfect storm. I'm not sure how much I like that, because really, if, you know, everything's a perfect storm, right? Like the whole universe is chaos, right? So a lot of things, this isn't a perfect storm, this is just life that was going on. At the same time that this was happening, we'll say it's a perfect storm for now. We also entered a period where, you know, city government and city budgets were at an all-time low, right? New York almost went bankrupt in the 1970s, all right? So staffing courts for this is, you know, is more difficult than you might think, which is to say public defenders, competent ones who are not overworked, are much less common than you might think. So your option as a defendant, 1994, is take a plea bargain. You know, if you're lucky, you'll get something. You know, like they'll just charge you with something so minor that you'll do time. But on the schedule, you might be down to that 8 1/3 years as opposed to 15 or 25 to life. Or, hey, you know, if you're feeling lucky, go with a public defender. He might get you off. Out of 200 clients he's carrying right now, you might be the lucky one. Trust me when I tell you that a lot of people did not take that second shortest. So we actually really don't have an accounting of how many people were locked up, or even are locked up now, who, you know, we don't know if they were anywhere near the scene of the crime, or if they had any kind of proportion of guilt whatsoever. Because a lot of them just pled out right there. They pleaded guilty, so that's it. So we really have no idea of what the kind of real status of guilt is with this. So in this, did I just skip the slide? Yeah, okay. I don't know why these are out of order, sorry. Here we see the population of incarcerated in New York State from 1880, a low of, this is persons incarcerated per 100,000 population. You notice how it's pretty much a solid between 50 and 100 per 100,000 people until about 1973. And then, I don't know how I make this little light, oh, here we go. Precipitous uprise here, right? Now, not all of it's from the war on drugs, not Rockefeller drug laws, but a lot of it is. When you think of that we kind of bundle up, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of governing through crime and drugs being part of that. If nothing else, this period here represents the triumph of criminalization over medicalization. You know, where we decide to deal with, let's just say there is a public health and medical crisis called addiction. It does not necessarily follow that we would have to deal with it by locking people up, right? I mean, this curve right here could have easily represented admissions to drug treatment programs. Or it could have easily represented budgets for harm reduction programs. Could have easily represented the amount we're willing to invest in education for people, right? But no, that's not what it represents, all right? We made a choice. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about this later on, but I just want to do a little bit of foreshadowing here. As I mentioned earlier, there's at least two ways of thinking about particularly black politics in the period of the Rockefeller drug laws, the early period, in the period leading up to the Rockefeller drug laws. One view holds that drug laws themselves emerged as a neoconservative reaction to the gains of the civil rights and black power movements. This is not simply a matter of backlash, but rather drug laws were part of a creative reconstruction of governance itself, where fighting crime became the state's foremost social welfare function, right? A good analogy for this, or an illustration of this, is in '68, LBJ, and by the way, we talk about conservatives versus liberals now, but a lot of this crosses party lines. So Democratic President LBJ declares the war on crime in 1968. We have the Comprehensive Crime Control Bill. Before that, what was the previous war on something? XXX, war on blank. What was that? War work. Someone might have asked, like, well, what happened to the war on poverty? Did we ever declare that one? Don't worry about that. We're moving on to the war on crime. Trust me, crime is more important than poverty. All right? By the way, the other war, which is a more literal war, was the war on the people of Southeast Asia as well, which is another way the war on poverty foundered. Because tell you what, you try waging a war in Southeast Asia and a war on poverty at the same time, somebody's going to run out of money. You can't do both at once. You made a choice. Well, LBJ made a choice. All right, and so Julie Kohler-Hausman has, I'm not going to read this quote here because you read her article, and I'll see if I can get you these slides later on as well. The second way of thinking about it is, again, is you've read Michael Fortner's piece, where he says that African-American mobilization for greater public safety in Harlem shaped the evolution of narcotics control policies in New York State from 1973. All right. This is just, I'm going to give you some more, these are some more data charts here. Drug offenders incarcerated in New York State by year. This is a very similar curve to when we saw the general incarceration rate, just to give you an idea. See this precipitous turn? We don't get a real decline until the early 2000s in drug offense from SU. Drug commitments as a percentage of total commitments. It started off in 1980, even 1980, right? Now, 1980 is before the crack years. And people aren't really that scared of heroin anymore because heroin's kind of working its way out. Like that epidemic has really faded by 1980. So drug arrests here are low. Reagan decides that drugs are really bad, and he runs in 1980 partly on war on drugs. He declares war on drugs in 82, and then crack shows up in the mid-80s, and then we're off to the races. And we just keep doing this until again in the early 2000s. Here we see rates of incarceration per 100,000 population under the Rockefeller drug laws in the year 2001. Who wants to tell me who are the most impacted here? Somebody want to just give this quick chart reading? Give you a guess. Look at this. Look at this. 1,500 plus per 100,000. That's more than 1 in 100. Incarcerated if you were 21 to 44 African American males. And 21 to 44 isn't like that's a big bracket. That, you know, that's still me. I'm still in that group for another year or so. You know, like, so 1 out of 100, more than that, 1.5 out of 100. And these are also prime earning years. This is what I'm talking about here. Like when we do a cost accounting for the war on drugs, it's not just about years lost, you know, freedom lost, but when you get somebody in the prime earning years like this, prime, you know, developmental years, you know, even those years when they're not afterwards, if they're not incarcerated, they're not going to be as optimal as they might have been had we not had this negative intervention right here. Am I making sense? It's cumulative effects. And then we're also talking about families, the whole nine. Let's look at some other. Hispanic males, they're not doing a whole lot better in that same age bracket, right? White males, that's nothing. 34 compared to 1,500 or 1,000. Yeah, white females, you know, that number, so you make it, why are we even watching Orange is the New Black? White women in drug laws. Not in New York State. 6 out of 100,000 in that age period. Black women, same 1 out of 1,000, 109. Compared, what's the ratio on that? That's a ratio of almost, yeah, it's like almost 20 to 1, or it's like 5.5, or something like that, like 19 to 1. Hispanic women not doing a whole lot better there. All right, you get my point, right? Orange is the New. You must watch a TV show about like a unicorn. But I should stop too, because A, I've never really watched this show, and B, I know there are more characters than that who I actually hear are like really well scripted, really well acted. So I certainly don't want to like put shade on like really hard working people. But I wish some of them were the star of the show as opposed to that unicorn. All right, U.S. incarceration rate in state and federal prisons. Here again, we see these are national trends. These are state and federal prisons national. Again, we see the same thing. A lot of these I put up here just because you might need them when you teach this work as well. So I know I have too many maps and charts here, but you can select which ones you want to use. These are imprisonment rates by state in the year circa 2008. You know, not for nothing, you see where that dark green is? There's South, Texas. Biko, that's you, man. Oklahoma. Yeah. You might need to stay with us for a while. Are you sure you want to go back? You don't go back on Saturday, do you? No. You might want to stay with us, bro. Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, you see that there. All right. Yeah, Oklahoma is, okay, they're not the worst. I mean, like Louisiana is still, yeah, you know, we all know about Mississippi, goddamn, Louisiana, man. Yeah. All right. I don't know why I don't have text next to this one here. But anyway, this is some more. Prison and jail incarceration rates for black and white men by age and education. This is real grainy. It looks better on like a laptop screen here. But the darker line, this is black men and white men. Darker lines for high school dropouts. There's also something, this curve looks the same, but pay attention to your y-axis here. The top for the white men, the top is 10%, the top here is 40%. Wow. Yeah, I know. Like at first I was looking, I was like, why didn't they even print this thing out? It's the same damn curve. Nah, by a factor of like 10. 40% for black is the highest on the y-axis. This is actually, you probably should have done this graph differently, but and here it's just 10. So it's not the same graph at all. In fact, this curve starts here and above 10%, where this one would have been started way up here. Yeah. Oh, that's why. There's text there. All right. Talk about some of these racial effects then. There is, I started to, last night when we had dinner, I had a really great time at dinner last night, by the way. It was a lot of fun. If you missed it, you're just going to have to get that, you know, have to get over your FOMO. I'll tell you. It was great. It was epic. Okay, it wasn't epic, but it was good food. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I know that some folks, I mean, y'all don't know me. I'm kind of known for putting a lot of reading on my syllabi, and you know, y'all are just, you know, you're very, you know, like, I really enjoyed the conversation, and everyone was very polite, but you also not very nuanced when some of you say, why do you put so much, you know, why is there so much work on the syllabus? Why have so many articles? And I know, I'm guilty as charged, I apologize for that. Believe me, it was worse before I actually, I took a few things off. And one of them would have been some pieces by Ernie Drucker. We have a quote from him here. He's an epidemiologist who turned his sights over the past 15 years towards the public health consequences of mass incarceration. I recommend this book. It's actually, it's not, you know, it's a strong book, but it's not like huge. It's, I think maybe a couple hundred pages. It's called The Plague of Prisons. Ernest Drucker is his name. Came out maybe about 6 years ago. And you know, when Ernie and I first talked about this is before the book even came out. He and I were sitting down, we were having breakfast, actually right around the corner, Deluxe Diner. And he and I were talking. It was summer afternoon or summer morning, similar to today. And he was talking about, you know, prisons themselves being an epidemic. And he wasn't being hyperbolic, like the way we say, oh, there's an epidemic of texting while driving, there's an epidemic, everything's an epidemic. It's kind of our way of saying something's bad, right? That's an epidemic. I make the case in one of the many pieces that I signed to you that, you know, we should think about epidemics in certain literal fashion. And he was being literal, and it took me like a while to actually wrap my head around it. He was saying that it's kind of a political epidemic. One state decides, you know, I got an answer to this drug problem. Let's just build more prisons. And by the way, somebody else I really wanted to, I really wanted to sign you all like 2,000 pages. Like I probably, left to my own devices, I might have done that. Like, I need to be stopped. An official cry for help, what this is. But if I could have, I would have asked you to read Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work, Golden Gulag, where she makes this, fascinating argument. If you think that prisons show up because, show up meaning the rise in prisons shows up because we have a rise in crime, there's a bridge that goes from here to another borough that I would love to sell you, those of you who are not from New York. Those of you who are men have heard this one before. It's not bad at all, actually. In a lot of ways, prisons are ways, Ruthie makes this argument very clear and compellingly. Prisons are a way to reconcile what Marx would have called a contradiction in capital. When capital runs, capital will run on a system, its own, or run in a mode. Sometimes, depending on the cycle of the business sector, 7, 10, 20, 30, 40 years or so. And then it's going to hit a crisis, a contradiction, where the assumptions, the economic and the social and political assumptions that drove it prove to be just completely, like they're either unmanageable or just untenable, unsustainable. And in California, you had a problem because, well, for one thing, California decided that they didn't want to lower their taxes, permanently. The property taxes in California are like, they've been low they had a tax revolt, I think, about 40, 50 years ago. I think it was in the 60s, 70s. I should know this, I should have committed this to memory. Then they also had mechanized agriculture. So you had a lot of people thrown out of work. You've got this land sitting around, not doing much, because there's actually more production with the land. I'm kind of summarizing the argument. I'm probably doing a bad job of it as well. But the short of it is that you've got land, you've got bodies. You can't just have bodies walking around unemployed because if they need jobs, they can do something, feed themselves, right? So prisons are an excellent way to reconcile a contradiction in capital. You're locking up a certain part of the population. By the way, if you really think that unemployment was really low during the 90s, like Clinton, like he just rescued us all from perennial high employment. No, he just locked a lot of people away. They don't show up on the unemployment roll. I don't believe anything about unemployment. You show me release versus conviction, how many people are coming out versus who are going in. Then if I can weigh that against what the unemployment data is, then you and I can start talking. But if you show up and oh, Sam, isn't this great? Unemployment's down to 6%. Put that away, because that doesn't mean anything until you start talking about who's locked up. Prisons will rationalize unemployment. You give employment to others. A lot of upstate communities here in New York. Try closing a prison in some of these communities in New York State and a lot of states. You will have pickets outside saying, literally, do not take our jobs. All right? These are jobs programs. These are stimulus packages, shovel ready. Those are some of the racial effects of the Rockefeller drug laws. Yeah.
What was the name of that book?
Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book is Golden Gulag.
Thank you.
I highly recommend that one because, trust me, the summary I did, I think, I'll have to review the tape. I'm not even sure I was using complete sentences. I was trying to describe it. I'm not sure I did it justice. But it's a brilliant book. And then the one before that was Ernie Drucker, A Plague of Prisons. Yes, Godfrey.
In the study, have we made a connection between that point and ethnicity, of shovel and jobs, prisons?
Oh yeah, race is always part of that. I'm sorry, I didn't make that clear. That's the assumption. Yeah, that's where all this comes from. All of this comes from right there. It's certainly demonization. As a drug historian, I'm one of those who argues that our drug policy, as a historian of African American politics, as a historian of drug policy, I'm one of those that argues that our reaction to drugs, meaning our policy reactions, be they criminal justice or medical, social or whatever, is not about the drug itself, it's about who's supposed to be using it. So yeah, race is always part of that. I think one of the pieces I had you read is one that I haven't published, but about race and the new heroin epidemic. Everyone's about the new face of heroin. And it's, our response is going to be, and rightfully so now, is going to be one of sympathy, of harm reduction, of interventions, of contact tracing. not locking up petty users. Hopefully we'll find the people who are making it and bringing it in, but if we don't, we're certainly not going to bang up heads over petty users. So it seems now. And that's the way it should be done.
Right.
But we should also question, oh, so why do we have, where did this font of magnanimity, of generosity and empathy come now? And when all the data that we have today was indicated when heroin was big amongst Black and Latino communities as well.
But even with cocaine, this coke era when affluent people openly taking cocaine in discotheques, was not a problem for the policymakers to plan.
Oh yeah, cocaine was the champagne of drugs, what it was called. And in fact, since we're talking about kind of epidemiology as well, that is how that's one way that crack cocaine entered, not just African American pharmaceutical, toolkit or whatever, or repertoire. There's other things too. You got to keep in mind that a lot of it was being flooded into South Central Los Angeles, in the Iran-Contra years and all that. But it was, this was like, hey, you know what? This is the working man's cocaine. You've all seen the movies of you could do lines of cocaine in the bathroom of Studio 54 and all that. But now you too, we've got this new. It's just freebase. That's all. And it's chemically, as far as I understand, the same thing as well. 100-to-1 disparities in sentencing where, until recently, until about 5 or 6 years ago, the same amount of crack cocaine gave you 100 times the sentence as that same amount of powder cocaine. And that's all based on race. There's no science to say. And even to this day, we're still arresting women in many states who are testing positive for drug use if they're pregnant. Even though the science was never conclusive about this thing, what do they call them, crack babies? There's two things you won't see in Black communities. There's a lot of things you won't. There's two things I definitely know you won't. And one is a unicorn. And the other is a crack baby. They don't exist. It's a mythology. All right? But we've locked up a lot of women and stigmatized them as well based on this mythology. So yeah, Godfrey, thank you for bringing that up. Because I've been just chugging along saying, I should not assume it. Race is assumed in this lecture, but we do need to spell a few things out. I could take maybe 2 more before I have to keep moving. So Lauren and Kaisha, and then Tosha, maybe we can come back around? Is that all right? Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry. I'm trying to see everyone too. That is Lauren and Kaisha, right? Yeah, okay, yes.
My question was whether or not you feel significantly different about the Obama administration than you do about the Clinton administration, given our current low unemployment numbers. And there's a lot of talk about the end of mandatory minimums, but we know that there are still a lot of people incarcerated off of those mandatory minimums, while we're also watching the rise of this whole other area of employment with the legalization or decriminalization of the same marijuana that got a lot of those same people.
I'm sorry, one more time there. I was distracted by something that was going on over here.
No, you're
I thought something was getting my attention, but not.
You were talking about Clinton and how Bill Clinton touts low unemployment numbers as part of the success of his administration.
Yeah.
The Obama administration does the same. That unemployment is below, fill in the blank percent, 5% or whatever, what was promised. But we know that a lot of those same people are still locked up. So do you feel differently about that, even though we've talked about the end of mandatory minimums, we see sentencing changes, but we're not pardoning people out? So. Yeah,
and I kind of stepped in it right there too, because I'm not an economist.
Okay.
So I guess what I can say is that in a period like the 90s where incarceration rates were in fact escalating, because you saw the curves, right? They didn't stop escalating until like 2003, 4.
Right.
In New York State, we saw 07, I think, is when they started to turn the tide. In a period of escalating incarceration, when you tell me that unemployment is declining, I get suspicious. Today, I think our rates of incarceration are declining, not at a rapid pace, unfortunately. But I don't think they're inclining either. So if there's a claim to a lower unemployment and we also have gradually decreasing incarceration rates, then I might give it more credence. But then again, we also have to look like what I understand too is I'm not an economist, but I've kind of read some work of, for example, historical economists or economic historians, and there's always or often a problem in comparing data on a longitudinal level because what gets described as unemployment in 2016 or employment might be different either in a definition way, definitively, or in an objective situational sense. So what a job that might have sustained you and even a family of 3 or 4 40 years ago, that's good employment. That's still the same job could be described as being full employment, but not it doesn't do the same. So I don't want to get too far into that, but I walked right into that when you were actually right to question.
I guess the other thing I want to throw in is the increasing number of news stories we have about states where marijuana has been decriminalized, legalized, all the terms along that spectrum, and how their unemployment rates are falling even lower because there's this whole new industry, but it's not the same people that are fighting, obviously, right?
Well, that's Darnell Moore's been doing some really interesting. I don't know if you all know him. He's a writer.
Yesterday at the Soul Summit, it was amazing.
Yeah, so you saw him yesterday. Okay, I'll be sure to tell him that, or when he watches the video, he'll hear you say that. But he's been doing some writing and videography work on this. Because you look at places like Colorado, where that's literally green money going on in Colorado. Yeah, sorry, the pun's just not escaping. But there's no brothers and sisters are really getting licenses for these dispensaries. Yeah, Kaisha.
Yeah, my question was about the crack baby myth. So were doctors falsely treating babies when they were trying to wean them off, claiming to try to wean them off of the drug, whether it was crack or meth? Because that was kind of confusing.
When you say falsely, how do you treat crack baby?
Isn't it to my knowledge that they claim that if a baby was subjected to the drugs in the mother's womb, that when they came out, that they had to be put on the drug as well so that they could be weaned off the drug, even with babies with meth and crack? Because I was having a conversation and I told them that it was a myth and I shared the article and they were like, but no, they have to put the babies on whatever.
Nah.
Get off of meth or crack. So,
Methamphetamine or you mean methamphetamine when you say methamphetamine?
So was
No, with an opioid addiction, quite often children who are born with heavy exposure in utero, you will wean them off, and it's very quickly, like methadone, minuscule amounts, and it's very quickly. It's not something like if you had a hardcore heroin habit and you were trying to detox, it might take you 10 days to detox, or you could just be on methadone indefinitely. But with cocaine, it's not the same. Withdrawal from cocaine isn't the physical effects. Even the physical effects of heroin, from what I understand, tend to be overstated. A lot of them are more kind of the feeling of anxiety that you develop from withdrawal. And cocaine, I think, one of the withdrawal symptoms is deep, depression, the crash of it. But there's not a physical, there's not the physical thing that we think about with like alcohol withdrawal, right? If severe alcoholism, the DTs are real. With cocaine, it's not. I think, keep in mind that what people knew then but just didn't pay attention to is that they weren't disaggregating for crack cocaine exposure and a whole other host of issues that come with a kind of chaotic life if you are a problematic drug user. If you are a problematic drug user in the 1980s and 90s, chances are you are living at the kind of margins, all right? With a certain amount of criminal record, you are not eligible for certain jobs. You may not be taking care of your health. Prenatal care may not be real, available or a priority. There might be tobacco ingestion, there might be alcohol ingestion, all sorts of things that would make a child be born premature and quite colicky when she was born. So a lot of the treatment for so-called crack babies wasn't more crack, but it was like sedatives and stuff. Yeah, so. I'm sorry, Atterbury, but I just really, because believe it or not, I think I'm still in the introduction of my lecture. Somebody said, oh. It is a tough crowd. Whew. All right, and I wasn't in the introduction. We're well on our way here. All right, and in fact, I'm going to skip some of these too as well. All right, so let's go back. Godfrey, you had a question about race as well. In the 1950s and 60s, New York City was, in a lot of ways, a epicenter, a ground zero for heroin use. This is a map of Manhattan. These are narcotics deaths. Left is place of death and right is place of residence. So in a lot of cases, it's the same. A lot of people would die in their neighborhood, but not necessarily, so which is why we have the two maps here. This line here is 79th Street. This line here is 125th. Right here. You are, more or less, right about here. Now, you know, today we've got American Apparel. Don't we have like a Pinkberry? And a bunch of stuff like you would not know walking down Broadway and 116th Street that this was literally the highest corridor for heroin in the entire island, even the Bronx. I'm sorry, this isn't the Bronx. This is this is Harlem and all the way up to Washington Heights, 125th to 165th here. We're right under the Upper West Side, 80th Street, 125th. And yes, even the Bronx. Now, the Bronx is big. Like, if we had taken just the South Bronx, this number would probably be higher than 155. Well, actually, I'm sorry. This is numerical, so it would not be. It would be less than that. But per capita, these are not per capita numbers, so they could be a little misleading. But anyway, you get a kind of an idea of what was going on there. This was in part, though, however, and these are just some of the neighborhoods as well. The highest here is East Harlem, Central Harlem and East Harlem have the highest. Riverside, Lower West Side, Morrisania is in the Bronx, Mont Haven is in the Bronx, and the Lower East Side are the highest neighborhoods there. I say this is just heroin though, all right? Heroin came to Harlem vis-a-vis organized crime, which in the post-World War II era basically made the decision that, in New York City anyway, that Harlem would be kind of the primary market for heroin. Prior to that, it was largely controlled by gangsters and the Lower East Side, who really just dealt heroin as an ancillary component to their trade in gambling and sex work, which is to say they themselves weren't performing sex work, they were pimps and whatever. And heroin was just kind of something that you could get with the deal, right? It wasn't their main bread and butter. This changed, the trade shifted to organized crime families that operated in East Harlem. These were largely Italian, whereas pre-1940, 1945, it was mostly Jewish gangster families that were operating the Lower East Side. And the idea was that if you kind of keep the trade in Harlem, you're probably not going to get too much heat, right? There's already official neglect there, already police corruption, white cops in a black neighborhood. And so the decision was made that it was focused primarily on black Harlem. This is, for those of you who are fans of, anyone know what movie I'm thinking of? Excuse me?
What did you ask?
Well, the movie I'm thinking of? That's no, The Godfather. The Godfather, yeah, that scene is based on what is actually documented fact, where there was a meeting where they all decided, like, this is how we're going to do the drug trade. A lot of the families said, no, that's dirty business. And they said, well, if we just keep it with black folks, then, that we'll see how that works. And in fact, some, 30 years after that, in the early 1970s, we found out that's pretty much what was going on with the Knapp Commission. The Knapp Commission was an investigation into rampant police corruption, primarily, in lots of parts of the city, but primarily in Central and East Harlem, where NYPD were found to be taking large bribes from organized crime, providing protection for gangsters, for criminals, and even selling drugs out of the trunks of their squad cars. Does anyone know what film I'm thinking of that's based on this? Serpico, right. Frank Serpico was the cop who testified against his colleagues, really risking his own life in doing so as well. All right. Now, I'm sorry, I did not want to do that. Just a couple of other things too. Back to the drug laws and their origin, all right? You read a piece there, so I'm just going to skim through this. African American, black and Puerto Rican communities in Harlem and East Harlem, and many whites as well, had been calling on the city to have drug addiction treatment programs as early as 1951, 1952. All right? We have to be careful. I bring this up because we have to be careful if we make the argument that it was African Americans who called for the Rockefeller drug laws, because that implies that they did not care about treatment. In fact, there was some 20 years of agitation going on. This is the subject of an article that I published that I asked you all to read for today. There was also something else that was a background information that you all should know. It was alluded to in Jalili's article, Jalili Kohler-Hausman's article. There was an experiment in 1966, beginning in 66 and 67, to have a program of forcible treatment in New York. This was before the Rockefeller drug laws. This was also called the Rockefeller law. This is him signing the bill, Governor Rockefeller signing the bill. The idea that, we're gonna, we opened up treatment facilities for people here and there, but they're not using them, so we're gonna force them into treatment. So this was a mixture between medicalization and criminalization, all right? The idea that you could force someone into treatment, by the way, that doesn't work. He found that out. By 1970, it was widely decried to be a financial, a political, and a therapeutic failure. This explains some of his frustration in 1973, when he said, we've tried everything. He had not tried everything, and those things that he had tried, he only tried for a brief period of time. And many of the things that he tried were actually wrong-headed, such as the Narcotics Addiction Control Commission forcible treatment. He goes from a mixture of medicalization or criminalization to one of whole-scale just criminalization in 1973. So this is another backdrop to what's going on. By 1970, they had 10,000 individuals in custody for forcible treatment, not for breaking any law, but just being deemed addicts by a physician. A lot of parents turned in their kids because they were worried. You hear on the radio that, oh yeah, they've got this treatment. All I got to do is sign this paper, and they'll get my boy some help. And then rumors spread very quickly about bad treatment in there. Corrections officers, and they weren't therapeutic officers. They were basically, a lot of them were just prison jail officers who had taken another civil service exam. Beating up young people in there. There was sexual assault in some of these places. Some 24,000 people went through this system before it was basically shut down. A little bit after the Rockefeller drug laws, around 1974. All right. At that point, Rockefeller says, to hell with it, let's just go whole hog criminalization. Yes? So,
Can you just say a little more on this to contextualize this photo for me, the Lawrence Pierce and the investment that he was doing seems to be very approvable.
So this is Governor Rockefeller signing the bill that creates NAC and the system of forcible treatment. His first director of that is Lawrence Pierce, who was a former Brooklyn prosecutor, not a therapist at all, not a drug treatment therapist. He's a prosecutor, and just coincidentally also African American. So kind of insulating Rockefeller from any charges of race. I mean, this was a speculation, anyway. I'm not saying that's what I believe, but I mean, certainly there are people who said this is very convenient that he got a black man to run this thing, since he's going to be locking up a lot of black people. Is that the context you're looking for, Rashaya?
Is it part of trying to mount an argument about the education of the African Americans towards these programs?
You said education?
Absolving himself of the responsibility how documented these laws were.
Yeah. Well, this bill that he's signing here is from 1966. This photograph's 1966. So this is just backdrop to 1973. I'm not sure that he's trying to deflect responsibility, because right now, in 1966, he's claiming this as like a brilliant idea. It takes about 3 years for people to say, you know, like there's lawsuits, like that's another lecture, it's another chapter, literally another chapter of the book as well. But I'm just kind of using it for context for the Rockefeller drug laws. Yeah. Yeah, I think I just went through some of this stuff here as well. Sorry, I'm gonna. Right, yeah, and this is more literature from California and New York were the two leading states in doing forcible treatment as well. There really was no consensus on what had caused drug abuse or addiction, let alone what it was, and let alone what rehabilitation was as well. And this is literature from, yeah. So while we didn't really have a good idea of how we define rehabilitation, we still don't really. Like, what does it mean to be recovered or rehabilitated from drug addiction? Like, I could ask, we could do a survey and I'd get like 30 different answers from you all. We certainly knew what it meant to incarcerate someone. So in a lot of ways, one of the many factors that led us down this road was that we're certain about how we do this, not certain about how we do this. So every time we try this and it doesn't seem to work, we can't find a quote unquote cure, it makes this idea look more attractive. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. And of course the drug drug war, which if we talk about the war on drugs expansively, I mean, it's Reagan who, well, Nixon declares it in 1971. It's Reagan who really turns into like a drug war apocalypse. Beginning in 82, we get the drug laws of 84, 86, and 88. Well, 86 and 88 for the most part. All these had the devastating effects on African American communities. I kind of led off the discussion with a lot of that as well. And as I also made the point that it's really not the drug itself, but it's who's deemed to be or who's perceived to be using it. And this goes again by, you know, I talked about marijuana was associated with blacks and Mexicans in the 1930s, crack cocaine in the 80s and 90s. Cocaine in the South in the late 19th, early 20th century was largely believed to be a black drug. So not surprisingly, the southern states were the leaders in Congress for taking it, putting it on a dangerous drugs list or banning its use through the Food and Drug Act of 1906. You look at Chinese with anti-opium laws. Who are Californians in the group? Like San Francisco and all that? Yeah, like that's where all those anti-opium laws originated in the 1880s and 1890s. Really is ways, because it's like, oh, the Chinese are using opium. It's a terrible thing, and it's going to waste away good white manhood and womanhood as well. So it's always been a racialized thing. The Volstead Act, you know, prohibiting alcohol. You know, it's like you had a lot of WASPs, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, who said, you know what, like these Catholics, they, you know, the problem is that they drink and go crazy. Like, you know, like they need to have some good, you know, Protestant. I'm not saying that's the entire movement, but there was a nativist anti-Catholic. And again, in the South, many of our most fervent prohibitionists were, you know, also anti-Negrophobes, as we might say, as well. Race has always been part of that. All right, so the rock with the, oh, here we go. And so the same with heroin and the Rockefeller drug laws. Nelson Rockefeller was appealing to a base which Nixon had identified as the silent majority. In 1969, anyone ever heard of this phrase, the silent majority? Believe it or not, Trump used it like a few months ago. I don't know if any of you all caught that. But he literally, I'm not sure he's smart enough to understand that he stole it from Nixon. But in any case, I don't know which one's more horrifying, that if he didn't know or he did it. But certainly the fact that he used it was, the appeal of the silent majority with Nixon was really, he was appealing to people. It's kind of like what we today might call a dog whistle, you know, political, like dog whistle politics. He was basically signaling people, the white kind of, you know, working class, You know, those of you, you know, people who, if you're just sick of this agitation of civil rights, you know, the riots, Watts, Detroit, Harlem, Chicago, Black Power, militants, anti-Vietnam War. If you're just sick of all of it, you know, this is kind of like the Archie Bunker kind of crowd that he's trying to appeal to. And he says, you know, I'm appealing to the great silent majority of people. You know, all these vocal hooligans and hippies who are protesting, like, the good basic, the heartland of America, that kind of idea. And so this is really where the Republican Party itself is going. You know, Rockefeller's a Republican as well. So he's also appealing to the same silent majority as well when he says, you know, this is something this is a contagion that is spreading to the suburbs and it's destroying families surely as an invading army, right? There's a certain amount of dog whistle politics in that as well. And I'm going to skip some of that. But again, like I said, people who were against the proposal in January included, okay, I just have this in here just as a link in case you want to look up something about Nixon's silent majority in his speech. Opponents, like I said, included many law enforcement officials, the District Attorneys Association of the State District DA's Association, and the Bar Association of the City of New York, all opposed as well. Mayor Lindsay of New York opposed. Lindsay had run in 1965 as one of his campaign promises was that he would actually expand drug treatment and also do it on a community basis where he would recruit some of the same protest organizations which through the 50s and 60s had been marching for more treatment. He promised that he would actually, you know, give them funding to run their own programs. This is one way that he carried, you know, by a very large margin, carried the Black and Latino vote in New York City, even though they were generally Democratic voting blocs. Mayor Lindsay was Republican, but I want to stop and say that he was so liberal that he was more liberal as Republican than most Democrats are today, quite literally. Like I think he was the first big city mayor to be pro-gay rights. He was against the Vietnam War. He was for civil rights. Like today, they'd call him socialist. Really, is what they. You know, only Bernie Sanders maybe would have stood next to him. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but yeah, kind of in a weird way. You know, only in New York City could a Republican be more liberal than most Democrats. And you know, he had started this program, massive treatment program, and he basically tells Rockefeller, it's like, look, man, we just got this thing off the ground, and we are showing promise. I had a long quote here, which of course I will not read. And you know, what you are doing here is nothing but frustration, and I strongly suspect that you are pandering to this silent majority, because you know this won't work. You know, locking people up. Like, how many are you going to lock up? New York City alone might have as many as 100,000 heroin addicts. You're going to lock each and every one of them up? Sure enough, they tried over decades. And so this was a point of consternation as well. And then, of course, there was African American opinion, which, as far as I have found, is overwhelmingly against these laws here. There were some African American preachers. There were about 2 or 3 clergy people who were supporters of Rockefeller at this time. They were accused then, and I strongly suspect today, of having been political hacks who were planted by Nelson, not planted, because I mean they exist. It's not like he just invented them in a laboratory. But I think he cultivated them, probably made some deals with them, maybe donations to the church, in exchange for their support. I say this because these are largely men. One of them, the most famous, is Oberia Dempsey, who gets a lot of play in Michael Fortner's work. But if you try to find anything about him before this period, he's very slim. His one issue, apparently, and he was a reverend, but he only shows up a few times in the papers, the black papers or the white papers, when he's talking about, when he's threatening vigilante violence against drug addicts, drug users. You don't see him leading any marches for civil rights. You don't see him running any soup kitchens. He only shows up when he wants to be spectacularly dramatic and carrying a baseball bat and threatening to beat up drug users. He's a bit of a kook. I would not say that he's at all representative of black political thought. On the other hand, there were many African American clergy who were very much in in opposition to the drug laws. And in fact, all but one of the some dozen or more African-American state legislators were also against it as well, and vocally so. The Amsterdam News, maybe the country's most famous black weekly periodical, black newspaper, came out early on against it. And in fact, the head of NAC, not Lawrence Pierce, because he resigns a little bit after 67, but this a man by the name of Howard Jones, who's African American, when they're forming the Rockefeller drug law propositions in the late 1972, they don't even involve him in the discussion because they know what he's going to say. They say, this is crazy. As a therapist and as a black man, this is stupid. What are you talking about? Which is why they never asked his opinion on it. And you know, when he did find out about it slightly before the announcement, he confronted the mayor or the governor, and the governor said, well, you know, it's already a done deal. We're going to announce this thing in a couple weeks. There is really no evidence to say that there was strong public opinion for these laws. This is not to say that African Americans were not concerned about drug use. This is not to say they were not concerned about crime. But that's a very different proposition than saying that even in 1973, they did not have the foresight of what this thing could have portended for black communities. And in fact, we have much more evidence of African Americans calling, you know, deliberately and vocally for treatment facilities. Also that, reading into the drug scene a critique of political economy. You would have people saying, you know, we have too many drugs on the streets, and in that same statement also say, whatever happened to educational equity, community control of schools? Or, you know, these youth don't have jobs, that's why they're turning to drugs. So you really can't isolate you can't isolate drugs, the politics of drugs, from the politics of so many other issues that were civil rights and economic justice issues at the time. To have African Americans say, yes, we are concerned about drugs, usually means that this is like drugs is here, but it's related to a constellation of other issues which they interpret as also contributing to that problem. If somebody says, yeah, you know what, I think we need to elect a governor who's going to do something with the drug problem. A white person saying that, who's a member of the silent majority, and an African American member of the Harlem community, that same statement would mean two very different things, is what I'm trying to say here. So you have to be very careful. If you look at the evidence, I'm not convinced that Michael Fortner has really read the evidence. He's read in a certain way that I do not agree with, and there's other evidence that kind of indicates differently. Along with when you find most African Americans, aside from kind of Reverend O'Brien Dempsey's of this world, who are articulating a concern about drugs, it's usually in that context as well. And this includes Charles Rangel, who 15 years later or less becomes the chairman of the House Narcotics Committee and is a big-time drug warrior. Even he is very clear that drug laws need to be going after international traffickers, not low-level users. And he's also calling for education and job opportunity for young people. So if there's ever a black silent majority, which is the title of Fortner's book, you would include Charlie Rangel in that, and I'm not convinced that he would fit in there as well. This is important because we have to think of a lot of things as we move forward. And I know I just went right through our break time as well, and I kind of figured, well, I'm close to the end, so I should just chug through. So we will get a break, but it'll just be after you're just all tired and passed out. This is all important for a number of reasons. As we move into the new period of drug reform and prison reform, you know, it is imperative that we think very carefully about not just what incarceration is, but also how we define recovery and rehabilitation. I would argue, and I have elsewhere, I'm kind of leaving some breadcrumbs here because I hope we can bring this up in discussion, that if there's one thing that we've learned from 125, 150 years of failed drug policy, is that to equate rehabilitation or recovery with complete drug abstinence is folly. It's a really dangerous way of doing public health and public policy. The idea that someone is only as good as the last time they fell off the wagon, quote unquote. And I'm putting those in derisive scare quotes. It's just really wrong-headed. It's stigmatizing. It's stupid too, right? I mean, it's, you know, what to say that you're just, you know, you've had, you know, relapses and that otherwise you're not recovered is really not a good way of thinking about things. In fact, what we find out is that most people who have problematic, you know, issues, problems with drug use, most of them actually don't need treatment. They quit on their own. Something says like, you know, some of them just get too old. When I say too old, I mean like they turn 33. Like that stuff, you know, yeah, those of you who aren't 33 yet, you know, I'm the ghost of Christmas yet to come. There's some things you just can't do. I can't pull all-nighters anymore. I certainly can't spend all night drinking and hanging out and carousing and think I'm going to be worth anything to anybody the next morning. And sometimes the morning after that, you know, 2 mornings later. You know, I never had one of those weekends when I was a younger man, and now it's like, I'll just take a beer, half a beer, and I'm good. You know, a lot of people just age out of it. You know, on their own, they just say, yeah, it's like, you know, a lot of people say, you know, I got tired of being hungover at work. I showed up late too many times and I didn't get promoted. You know, got tired of like not enjoying my kids', you know, soccer game because I'm all hungover hanging out in the sun, you know. A lot of people just kind of, you know, they mature, it's what they call maturing out, most people. And a lot of those people, you know, we kind of think of this thing as problematic drug use as being something where like you're just an abject addict. Junkie, right? Like I question the existence of this thing called addiction, to be honest with you. There's so many other conditions that go into that. Some people are self-medicating for depression. Is that the same thing as someone else who has another, you know, another issue going on? Why do we call them both addicts, right? You know, that doesn't really make any sense, right? You're defining a disease based on the symptoms, not on what the actual etiology, the pathology of it might be. You know, a lot of people just kind of slow down their use and control it. You know, like I said, you know, as a younger man in college, like, you know, it's like, you know, be at the library till 9 or 10 o'clock, and then I'm raging till 3 in the morning, and it's like, wake up the next morning early and go back to the library. Like, I could manage all that. I'm not that person anymore. Did I just quit alcohol? No, most people didn't. You know, they just managed their use. A lot of people who had problems, you know, with a lot of substances, just, you know, they just said, you know what, like, I matured out. And there's people who have more problematic issues with it. Today's this new heroin epidemic, or the new face of the heroin epidemic. One of the responses that we find our public officials embracing is that of harm reduction. Harm reduction is the idea that you don't actually just sit there and pass judgment on a person for using a substance. You don't even make it your primary goal to get them to stop using it. You just make sure that if they're going to continue to use a substance, that they're doing it in a safe way, that they have some modicum of control over their lives. I started off this lecture saying that the biggest threat, or at least one of the biggest threats to African American public health has not been drug use, but drug laws. A harm reduction model would say, well then, let's just think about these drug laws then, right? If we can reach people who have problematic drug use, and most of them who are like deeply problematic, there's a lot else going on. Like I said, some self-medication, you know, unstable, you know, there's trauma, unstable living conditions. There's a whole other things that are more important. It's like, oh, we just need to get you off this heroin or this cocaine or this K2. It's like, actually, no. Like, I just want, like, can you help me get a job in a house? I got a criminal record. I can't get a job, and I got kicked out of my housing. Let's work with that first. A harm reduction approach will look at those hierarchy of needs first and think about, you know, can we get you to cease drug use? That's the very, you know, close to the last thing on the list because it's not as important. I would argue that as we move into this era of reform, we need to take that seriously because as long as we have this idea, this naive political modernist logic that we will find a cure for this thing called addiction, that our goal is to get everyone just to use, you know, to not use dangerous drugs at all and the ones that aren't dangerous, because liquor is, you know, alcohol is dangerous. I don't know if you all know that. Like there's a few other drugs that you could use more safely, like physically and socially, than alcohol. Like alcohol mess you up, like cirrhosis, all that, you know, like it's real out there. That and tobacco, by the way. You know, if you're drinking and smoking, you cannot pass judgment on somebody who's using heroin. Like, just, you know, you just chill out. Like, you know, I mean, in terms of the personal health thing. But as we move forward, we need to kind of think creatively about our social politics, right? We need to get rid of all that stigma. You know, like we should not, you know, I cringed at using, you know, when I talked about the word junkie. You know, I cringed at it earlier, and that's the reason. That's not a word that we should be using. You know, we talked about people as crackheads in the 1980s and 90s. Stigmatized a whole group of people. And we're also blind to, you know, what really drug laws were doing. These are going to be some big decisions, because at some point we're going to have to decide how much of this do we actually accept. And I would say right now, for many of us, our threshold is not high enough. Like, we have zero tolerance for any kind of drug use, for any kind of infractions that are drug involved. And that's not the way to do it. Like, if the option is to keep reaching out to people and helping them keep their lives whole and make their lives better through whatever it takes, or you just lock them up and throw away the key, because they'll all come back home anyway. They're going to come back more damaged. Then I think that choice is very clear, but it's going to call on all of us to really deeply and creatively rethink all of our assumptions about drugs and, you know, how we should orient ourselves toward them. I went a bit over, but yeah, so thank you very much. I'll take some questions too. Were there any questions besides can we go eat or Califani, sorry.
Thank you. So I had a question about when we were talking about unemployment going down as it relates to incarceration going up. Do you know how census data counts inmates? Or, I mean, even if prisons were in the same location as they were in, like, where were the prisons and how did they count for, like, census?
You mean like in terms of what census tracts they go to?
Yeah.
New York just changed its plan. And this is like many things in a federalist system like ours. It's a state-by-state thing. New York just changed, like I want to say no more than 3 years ago, its policy where we in this state count people in prison as being members of the districts from which they came. Most states are not like that at all, which is a problem for a number of reasons, right? Because not only are upstate counties in a lot of states getting paid to keep people in downstate. I'm using upstate, downstate because that's how we talk about New York, but in another state would be, you know, the city versus some small rural town or whatever. They're getting paid to warehouse and cage people from the city. Then also, when the census gets counted like that, then they get the political representation. So all of a sudden, you know, some podunk county that has 5,000 people in it, free people, but they got a supermax with 10,000, with 5 or to 10,000 people in it. Now all of a sudden, let's say it's got 5 people, now it's counted as double, which means you get double the tax revenue for, you know, double that goes towards, you know, a whole lot of stuff that the feds would give you. And in voting representation, by the way. Very much, by the way, not by the by. As a historian, I rarely say that history repeats itself or that nothing has changed. Like, I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at history. However, just because history may not repeat itself, but often whistles a similar tune. All right? And this is how we got the 3/5 compromise with slavery. You know, you had Southerners saying, well, it's like, no, we got all these people. These are people. They should be counted here for representation. It don't matter that there's a plantation of 150 people and there's only one person here who can vote. Because it's me and my wife, and she can't vote until the 19th Amendment. So it's just me and slaves and women, white women, slaves and white women. But it doesn't matter because I still should be able to get that power of 150 votes in there. So that's how they got the 3/5. The Northern said, well, you do have those people, but they're not whole people and for voting. So you're going to get 3, for every 5, you get 3 votes or 3 counts on that. It's the same, it's a very similar situation. Yeah. Now New York just changed that. I cannot tell you how many states are like New York now, but I want to say the majority are still doing the old school way, which is you are counted in the district in which you sit. Not so you're, you're upstate, not in Brooklyn, not in the Bronx, not Manhattan. Well, I'm sorry, in New York you are, but I'm saying an analogous, like let's say like Philly or another state where they have it. Oh, Joy, sorry.
You had mentioned in your closing comments about having a higher threshold and drug laws being the issue. And so I'm wondering if, while I know that the marijuana issue is a very hotly debated topic, but is your thinking along the lines of having dispensaries or some place where people, I think in Amsterdam, I don't know if it's true, where they have places where people can go and get clean needles. Is that really what you're talking about in terms of high? Okay.
Yeah. Harm reduction embraces that and a lot of other things as well. So syringe exchange is certainly part of that. Because remember, what comes with modern, meaning the last 30 years, drug issues, are HIV and hepatitis C and all kinds of other, all these things that you get from dirty needles. If someone is using drugs, they should not also get, all those other things compounded with that.
Right.
Yeah. You had a follow-up question, I take it?
And so then the follow-up sort of is, I think you had mentioned about the length of time that people were getting in prisons. Has there been research as it relates to the effect on, let's say, the aging population as these people are coming out, these people who are now elderly or in that baby boomer type stage, period? What is their life? What are their lives like now, so to speak?
Yeah.
Is there research that shows sort of the ripple effect that is showing the ripple effect? So not just from the historical, but what are they feeling now as a result, living now from?
Yeah, I was part of, 2 years ago, I was part of a working group. There was some public health people. We were a small minority. There were people who worked in reentry services. We had the former commissioner of corrections for the state who was part of this group. And I helped organize a conference here at Columbia on that issue of aging prisoners. And we published a report. I was the editor of the report. And ironically, I cannot remember the exact name, but if you were to Google my name and aging people in prison, it would show up because it's online.
Okay.
We printed it out. In fact, there might be some print copies at IRAAS if you want to take a look at it, and you can download the PDF there. So I can speak a bit about that, particularly for New York, but I think this holds for most other places as well. One of the many problems of mandatory minimum sentences, which, by the way, were not just restricted to drug laws. We expanded after 1968, particularly in the 1980s, our definition of crime so capaciously that people were getting locked up for long periods of time for things that 15 or 20 years ago, they might not have been locked up at all. Some things that might not even been considered a crime. Like, we just redefined crime over the past 40 years, basically. And then a lot of those took mandatory minimum sentences. So what we had, as your question alludes, so we have one of the oldest prison populations now that we've probably ever had. It's not corrections, it's just, just eternal punishment. What comes with that are the, kind of just general effects of aging, but which are accelerated in prison. So they say, like, after a certain age, I think like after 40 or 45, you just tack on 15 years to your age to get your prison age. So if you're 50 in prison, you probably look more like a 65-year-old. And you have the health profile of somebody that age or older. The hypertension, diabetes, all these just general aches and wear, all that. The other problem with that, too, is that except for those who unfortunately, expire, who perish in a prison, they will come home. And for being away for so long, that makes the reentry process much more difficult for everybody. The other irony of it is that the people who get in for the longest, we really don't, in the 80s and 70s, when the 80s and 90s, we were locking people for nonviolent drug stuff up for a very long time. That's not so much now. We still have to think about what's violent crime, because violence, we think we know what violent crime is. You'd be surprised, like, what can happen, and all of a sudden you look in the rule books, that is actually described as a violent crime. So we have to rethink that. Then also, one of the major, I don't want to call it an irony, but it's like it's one of those kind of interesting things, or a who'da thunk moment. The people who spend the longest time in prison are often people who were there for murder, right? However, they have, once they're released, they have the lowest rate of recidivism. So like my friend I was saying about, who was actually part of this effort that I was in 2 years ago, he did 33 years for murder. He said, it's like, yeah, I did it. But the thing is that most people, first of all, some people are, car thieves. Some people are shoplifters. They are identity thieves. Like that's kind of where there aren't that many murderers out there. You see what I'm saying? Like, like where it's like, that's the only way I know how to make money, or, So recidivism is actually very low for that. A lot of people who are in for murder, a lot of it was a kind of like fit of rage or revenge, kind of youthful male, bad judgment that you would not do at the age of 30 even. What we know now about brain science is that, human brain is not really formed until you're 25. There's no reason why you should be able to be 18 and carry a gun and go to war. I'm not even sure 18-year-olds should vote sometimes, but that's just, we should probably edit that off the tape. I love my 18-year-old, the 22-year-old students, they're all fantastic. That was an exaggeration. I do believe they should vote. But there's a lot of things going on, like, I don't think we should send an 18-year-old to war, and now we certainly should not be trying them as adults when we now know the human brain is not fully formed to age about 25. So we have people who are doing 3, 4, 5 decades for murder when they probably came out at, like, they stopped being dangerous probably around the time they turned 35. And like my buddy is a fantastic example of that. Like they finally released me. I actually don't even know why they released me. I'm no different now than I was 15 years ago. I got 3 master's degrees. I've been doing all this good civic work within the prison. Like, like nothing's changed. Someone just said, "Oh, let's let him go." Yeah. Does that make sense? It's a counterintuitive, right? That we would, and the thing is that people get caught up on parole based on the, quite often it's the nature of the crime, not how you are today. Right. So you can be fully rehabilitated, model citizen, better than most of us in this room. Right. In fact, it's like, no, but you killed somebody in cold blood back in 1986. Yeah, but it's 2016 now. Any other questions? Yeah, Peter.
I'm wondering a little bit about kind of relationships between how personal narratives were received in terms of users and dealers. Like we're looking now with the such, like, if we want to look at it as today, like the silent majority have the wave of empathy that's coming with the narratives of, say, like the former high school soccer star from the suburbs that then gets into opiate painkillers, then moves into heroin. Like we see that huge rash of empathy now. Mm-hmm. But that, I mean, obviously that's existing. Those similar narratives are existing in, say, 1964 in Harlem, where like Harlem studied youth in the ghetto, right? That Dr. Clark is writing about, and we're hearing these two like major thematic narratives about drug use as escapism from this oppressive societal institutions, and then drug use as a means, drug selling and dealing as a means of necessity and survival. There's such limited opportunities for many people, and so obviously we see how poignant those narratives are now, mm-hmm. for particularly like white youth drug users. But I'm wondering what kind of reception or impact amongst policymakers or just general populations those kind of reports or voices had.
In the 60s and 70s? I mean, not enough to stop the Rockefeller drug laws. HARU, which is Harlem Youth Organization Unlimited? Right, yeah. Yeah, Youth Opportunity, I'm sorry, yeah, not organization, sorry. Actually was the host in Harlem of a major meeting where there were black elected officials, state legislature mainly, but also I think there were some Congress people there, community leaders, etc. who were all saying, and this is in February 1973, so it's about a month or so after Rockefeller makes his announcement, and they're all saying, this is nuts. Like, this is a terrible idea. We all know who this is going to fall. It's going to be Black and Puerto Rican youth who are going to catch the brunt of this. That scene is replicated all across New York City, really. And it doesn't stop. I mean, you know, Rockefeller has, like I said, he's got literally like less than a handful of Black people who are on his side. Like, it's Reverend Dempsey, or Barry Dempsey, and there's like 2 other cats who are even more obscure than he is, whose names, they're in my notes here, but like I skipped over that a long time ago because we would have been here too long. The overwhelming majority of Black opinion was against these laws. And the narratives, like you said, were there, but it wasn't enough to sway Rockefeller. And Rockefeller did a very good job of swaying, you know, the white state legislators who initially had been against it. There were a lot of people in his party, in the Republican Party, who were against the idea. So he changed a few things. You guys saw the initial proposal versus what really actually passed 4 months later. That was after several weeks of negotiations. And only then was he able to get, and it was not an overwhelming majority. It was like 80, I think it was like 80 to 65 in the Assembly, and a smaller margin in the Senate as well. It wasn't like that's another myth too, that you know, everyone supported the Rockefeller drug law. That's not true at all. They certainly did not overwhelmingly support his initial proposal. So the narratives didn't really, I guess your question was mainly about what, like, the narratives of sympathy. That doesn't really, it doesn't win the day at all. I mean, in 65, you've got Man-Child in the Promised Land, right? And if anything, you know, his tale is the cautionary tale of someone who escapes all that. You know, Peary Thomas, like what is that, 67? What's Peary Thomas down these mean streets? I want to say 67, but for some reason that seems too late. But there's similar drug memoir. I mean, it's not one that's used for political ends either. You know, of the 3 most famous non-white drug memoirs of that era, it's those 2 and Malcolm X's autobiography. Only that last of which is used for political ends, but Malcolm wasn't really engaging. Well, I mean, you know, he's assassinated before any of the stuff comes down the pike. Anyway, so like, you know, drug laws aren't really part of his engagement anyway. His engagement is civil rights and Black power. It would be interesting to know what he would have thought had he, you know, lived another 8 years to see the Rockefeller drug laws. And people aren't really using his autobiography in any way to think about sympathy for what they called addicts or junkies either. It's just not happening. Today it's happening because, like, you know, it's Kimmy from the suburbs. Poor girl was playing around with Oxy, and then I shouldn't make light of it. I mean, it's terrible, yeah. But I mean, that's how it happened in the 60s and 70s too. Like, all these narratives of accidental, like, I was being stupid. You know, me and some friends after school decided we'd try this new thing. That's how it happened. You think like thousands of Black people just say, you know, I think I want to have a really bad drug problem. No, everyone was experimenting, but they didn't get the sympathy that people get today for it, that white people get today. Yeah, sure.
At the same time, you have the Moynihan report, which moves the discussion from individual failures to the larger group.
Right.
So that's why, as I was reading reading these 2 pieces by Fortner and
Hausman,
I'm looking at these and I can understand why he came to the conclusion that he did and how she came to the conclusion she did, or he. Because I think there's a difference there in how they are reading what happens to the group and what happens to the individual, and how the individual is allowed a number of freedoms, if you will, where you can have the sympathy for the individuals, but you can't have the same kind of sympathy for the group because the group is showing that they're just bad people. This is a fluke over here, but these people are bad people. And I think the Moynihan report had something to do with that, where it's no longer a matter of structural issues, it's a matter of
Cultural failings.
Cultural
Yeah.
issues or individual, these are no longer just these individual affairs as they are with these folks who are now the sympathetic few. These are the undeserving folks over here who do not
Yeah.
deserve our sympathy. So as I was reading it, I'm looking at it from, a sociological perspective and trying to make sense of the structural versus the individual and how people are using that to make the claims that they make about who's deserving of sympathy and who's undeserving.
Now what I ended, that's an interesting point there. Where I ended my comments, which was kind of, this rhetorical challenge to the group that we need to rethink our ideas about drug, and implied in that is like rethink our, our empathic abilities as well. That you do not see in abundance in black politics in the 60s and 70s either, except amongst, I would say, like drug treatment professionals. There's this emerging class of drug treatment professionals in the 60s and 70s who kind of have a more intimate idea of what it is. Some of their ideas are very wrong about how drug addiction happens and all that, but their experience and knowledge of the scene itself gives them a certain empathic ability that your mainstream black, Harlemite may not have. But I mean, with the like, there's this crisis in liberalism, right? I mean, Moynihan, he's firmly in the Democratic Party, right? He's working in the Department of Labor when he puts that report out for LBJ. He's classically liberal in the most problematic but common ways. And so, I mean, the piece that I asked you all to read about epidemiology or epidemics versus plagues, I mean, that's a large part of the point, right? I mean, liberals who would be against, I mean, you have hardcore conservatives who basically say, oh, well, the problem is that, we all know that the cranial size of the Negro is too small and it's all pathological, and that's what, you got that, and like, I don't know what to tell you about that, right? Then you have conservatives who are like, well, they're just shiftless and, better off in slavery. Don't know what I could do about that. But then you have liberals who say, oh, well, this is a legacy of slavery, of cultural damage, damaged psyches, and of course they're going to be prone to drug addiction because, racism has damaged them, right? And that was very palatable in liberal circles. Which is why Moynihan couldn't figure out, it was like all these black sociologists came gunning for him. It's like, I'm on your side. It's like, no, you're not at all. And so that line of arguing, that white liberal line of arguing, is just as wrong as that hardcore white conservative line of argument. And when I call it white liberal, I mean, you also have a number of African Americans who are making similar arguments as well, who are saying, conditions in the ghetto are so bad that, of course, all the youth are turning to drugs. We also know, that's why I started off that piece with Anne Brunswick's work. We actually, she asked the question, like, well, if conditions are so bad, why am I not finding more black kids on drugs? And how come when I interview them only 3 years later, the rates of people who have even experimented with drugs in the past 6 months is in half? So that lets us know that it's not those issues at all. It's the same thing, that it's an epidemic curve. 3 years ago, more people were trying it, they thought it was cool. 3 years later, they're kind of coming down off the hill. It's like, no, heroin's bad. Like, heroin was cool in the 50s when, bebop and all that, and then my older brother tried it in the early, mid-60s, and now I saw so much bad stuff go down that I'm actually basically almost immune to its attractiveness, because I've just seen too much bad. You get what I'm saying with that? That has nothing to do with because things are bad in the ghetto or whatever. Because if you take heroin out the picture and just talk about all drugs, which is really the way to do it, while we're talking about what's going on in Harlem with heroin, in the suburbs, it's amphetamines, it's benzos, what these call goofballs, very dangerous substances as well. So it's only when you think about, when you reify this thing called the drug. But heroin was in Harlem, not because, you know, black people love heroin or there's something about the ghetto that makes it. It's because that's where it was being distributed. In the ghettos, I'm in the suburbs, they're getting benzodiazepines. You know, they're getting, you know, amphetamines, diet pills, stuff that people in Harlem don't have access to. So it's all about social networks and you know, market networks, circuits. I mean, I guess you get what I'm saying with that. Yeah, so I mean, that liberal argument is real. And see, and that's the thing that we're still hung up on today as well. So the whole thing is like when, you know, when Becky shows up, you know, with, we need to have a reason. How did this happen? We always know why it happens in Harlem. It's like, no, actually, we don't know why. Like, people knew, but y'all never listened. And Brunswick knew. Other epidemiologists knew. But you just, liberals and conservatives alike just assume because that's just life in the hood. That's how they do it over there. That's not actually at all. So, yeah, sorry. I just realized I think I blacked out for a minute. I was just like in a fugue state of just rage and frustration. And I'm looking at you the whole time and you're just like, what's wrong with this?
No.
Yeah,
My
so.
mind is still working because all I can think about is after the Moynihan report, there was that backlash, and then you had like these folks who were the cultural relativists and the cultural yeah, there's another word. Anyway, so everybody is like now kind of defending their position using all of these various arguments where you kind of got the feeling that people were just trying to defend what people were doing, but not really talk about it in a way that was meaningful and realistic. And I see the same thing when we talk about issues like of homelessness. We are looking at homelessness very differently depending on the populations we're referring to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Because homelessness in New York is basic. I'm not sure our politics have evolved since the 1980s or 90s. Whereas there are other cities where the homeless population is more white, where they're getting a lot more progressive about it.
I've seen such like homelessness in Portland where you can be on the streets and nobody's really trying to arrest you or move you.
Yeah.
But I know if you were if you look different, you would have been picked up a long time ago and moved, you know, someplace else. So I just, you know, again, that's a sociologist.
And you know, that's another, I mean, here's another, I have a lot of soapboxes, but another one of mine is that in progressive politics, particularly this kind of public policy stuff, you know, there's this white liberal, like they think it's a smart strategy. It's like, well, now that it's happening to white people, we can make white people the face of it. And then incidentally, and you know, in an ancillary kind of way, this will also help black people. And that, like, I don't understand what kind of naivete informs that.
Cultural ethnocentrism and cultural relativism.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I thought you were saying that's the naivete that informs that. Yeah. I think we could do a few more, and then I know, Elizabeth, you said you're going to start setting up some snacks or something? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, it is set up. Okay, all right, yeah. So I guess, oh, and it's like 4 o'clock too, so I could probably take like a couple more. Biko, I saw you had a hand up.
Yeah, when you were talking about the harm reduction, the hierarchy and needs, it was making me think of polyversal humanity, and I was going to ask.
What humanity? I'm sorry to hear you.
Yeah, polyversal humanity, where, you know, desire, sex, reproduction, labor, creativity, all flow from the human body, and that's what connects all humans. And my question is, would it be problematic to think of maybe the war on drugs in a similar fashion to colonial projects or like third world as a project or imperialism, because that whole compassion aspect of, you know, the white face of heroin now and the fact that they're getting kinder treatment, maybe it's because I'm asking because of how I'm seeing all these things like colonialism, imperialism, war on drugs as where we other group of people dehumanize them, and then we kind of base our treatment on how we view them. And so with the war on drugs, you have the druggies or the addicts and all that, and then and they were all race, gendered bodies, and then with colonialism, the savage and all of that. So would it be wrong to see those as part of like a bigger critique of how we other groups of people, or does that make sense?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in a kind of, it sounds like you're doing like a cultural genealogy of this, and certainly, yeah, I mean, that's kind of, yeah, I mean, when in doubt, I would, like, I'd put chips on that like just even in a lot of ways, right? I mean, like at the beginning when I was describing some of the architecture here, and I kind of like, you know, snarkily talked about, you know, pseudo-Greco-Roman architecture. That was me kind of saying, yeah, it's like the ethnocentrism is so deep that it's in the architecture. So yeah, I mean, certainly that's always part of the project. In terms of, if we were to kind of put that in a mix with not just the kind of, you know, or along, I don't want to say not just, but along with the cultural genealogy, but also thinking about, you know, what is mid-20th century capital, and what are some of the isomorphic relationships between how it operates and what, you know, we then called the ghetto, versus how it operates in a dying colonialism in North Africa or in Central Africa or, you know, in Southeast Asia, for example. So then, I mean, then it's when, I mean, it's not for nothing that you have the Panthers who are reading Fanon, you know, who are reading Mao, Che, you know, it's because they have that third world Marxist critique of capital. There's a reason why, you know, Stokely Carmichael and Hamilton, Charles Hamilton, you know, write in '67 where they talk about the ghetto as a colony. It's not to be hyperbolic. It's like, this is an expropriation of labor, of value, of wealth, and ultimately of bodies themselves. You know, all wrapped up in a kind of, you know, a regime, not just a juridical, but all the way down to the ontological, epistemological regime of race itself. So I think that connection is there, where you keep trying to, I'm talking too much. So.
Right, and the tools, and you know, and what he said in White Man Listen, how the Europeans can pass the tools on to, you know, the darker people of the world, and maybe, you know, seeing the war on drugs as part of that toolbox, that kit, where, you know, it's just reinvention of that model, that colonial project, is different iterations of it through time. And then we got the war on drugs that we're dealing with in America. And my other question was like, do you know of any, like, was this like a global thing, the war on drugs? Was this in other parts of Europe, or was it just exclusive to America?
It becomes global, but because it's exclusive to America. In the sense that by the 80s, the United States, and, you know, now we're talking Cold War politics as well as kind of third worldist politics. The United States throws its weight around and influences all of the drug conventions. I think even until ones like being passed. Like, I mean, UNGAS, the UN General Assembly on, or the one that was like was it last month or 2 months ago, that dealt with like issues like drug conventions and stuff. That's the most interesting thing that happened in international drug policy in some years. Yeah, because there was a long dark winter when it's basically, if the United States says it's what happens, then that's the way it's going to happen in the United Nations. Yeah, that colonialism question, we could talk more about that, because there's ways in which, I mean, because you can also go, I talked about the ontological, epistemological. There's also ways in which, just how do we think about what is ethical citizen, like in terms of like a Foucauldian way, like bodily ethics, like what is responsible citizenship. These are all things that are given to us from a Western, you know, and shall I even say kind of 19th century and 20th century idea of, you know, self-control and, you know, abstemious abstinence that, you know, particularly for like black bodies in this country is never a winning proposition. No matter how, that's why respectability politics doesn't work. You know, if you think that by abstaining from every substance and, you know, wearing a suit and tie every day, you're depriving yourself of some fun times. And you're also probably physically uncomfortable. And you might as well just do what you want to do, because ultimately the outcome will probably be very similar anyway. If I thought it would get you somewhere, I'd wear this tie and a suit all if I really thought it was going to get me somewhere. But it's like, I've been harassed with a suit and tie, I've been harassed without one, so why put myself through the bother? Okay, that was definitely digression, so we should. Tarika, and I think maybe you're the last one. Or actually, I think Carol, you had your hand up, and then Tarika. Is that right? It is Carol, right?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay.
This might be kind of a tangent, but you talked about the hospital in Lexington and the Vietnamese relationship to it. And so I just wondered, I don't know a whole lot, but I'm curious if you can speak on when we talk about the distinction between medicalizing and all this, you know, what exactly was going on in Lexington? Because lots of people are in and out of there, and how this is sort of trying to, like, what's going on here.
Yeah, Lexington Hospital is a federal narcotics. U.S. Public Health Service starts it in 1935. There's two of those hospitals, one in Fort Worth, Texas, one at Lexington, Kentucky. And it's basically a place where you could either volunteer for treatment, drug addiction treatment, or you could be remanded there by a judge, depending. And Lexington served east of the Mississippi, Fort Worth was west. So people from all over. Largely at, largely New York, Chicago, Philly were at Lexington. It was a medical proposition in the sense that it's staffed by physicians and nurses who were doing treatment as it existed back then, and quite a bit of research, which was weird too, because there was also a different wing inside Lexington where they were actually paying people to take drugs, experimental drugs, including LSD. It was really weird to think of a place where you checked in to not use drugs, and they say, hey, you want to use drugs and make money and have your own room, like good meals, like they really pampered you with this. And ultimately it was deemed to be a failure for a couple of reasons. One is that people started, towards the end it became a blacker institution. Heroin was largely, in the 30s and 40s, it was mostly the white sporting class, working class. For African Americans, it would have been alcohol, marijuana. That was basically it. Sometimes cocaine. Heroin becomes more black and Latino in the late 50s and afterwards. And during that period, the staff stays white. So Lexington gets a reputation for also being racist as the population became more black. And then people just weren't getting cured, quote unquote, which no place were people getting cured of addiction. I mean, I'm not sure it happens today, really. For most people, you deal with it, you control it, and the issues that give it rise. Yeah. Does that answer the question about Lexington?
Yeah, as far as cured, that's just recidivism, right? So you're winding in. This is something that the guy that I interviewed, he talked about winding in and out of Lexington. I just wondered.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's,
yeah, a lot of people go there. A lot of people would go there and other treatment places. I mean, you still see this too. They would go to places to just detox for 2, 3, or 4 weeks, and knowing that they were going to go back to heroin when they got out, but with the idea that my tolerance will be lower, and I can get just as high for a smaller amount of money, which usually doesn't work for more than a day or so. Usually your tolerance goes back up to where it was within a couple of days. But we can also think of that as a kind of a way of self-harm reduction, or at least not self-harm reduction, a way that people manage their usage. Most people who use these substances, and even on a fairly regular basis, most of them aren't the wanton, abject, squalid, souls that we want to depict them as, or that James Brown did at the top of this lecture, oh so long ago. That was a while ago when I played that song for you. Most people are I'm trying to get rid of this thing, but right now I'm just going to control my usage and just get this, if I could just get a clean needle and protect myself as best way possible until I kind of sort everything else out. That's where I want to be. Those are my goals. So, yeah. And I think we said one more. Tarika, yeah.
Yeah, I was just trying to draw connections, and I was really thinking about media representations of drug abuse and linking it to Patricia Hill Collins. She, in Black Feminist Thought, she talks about controlling images of oppression. Mm-hmm. And so all these scenarios of the quote-unquote junkie, crack baby, crackhead, basehead, which leads into welfare queens, which leads into thug and unfit dads, attack on the Black family, and just as an 80s baby, I just remember so many images on the TV screen about drugs, about drug abuse, about the war on drugs, about
the commercials, in those images and the effects of those images and how it really, I think, scared and shaped the American public, and it's still, and the images are still used in other ways.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and then as a sociologist, I also think about, so when we present the statistics about the incarceration of Black men and the disproportionate incarceration rates, yeah, at the same time, I think it's also important to say that, you know, if we look at sheer numbers, numerical numbers versus the rate at which, so I'm not trying to say that African American men are, yes, they are disproportionately incarcerated, but when we think about the face of a prisoner, like we say, how does a prisoner look? In your mind, if you go to a Black male, you're actually wrong in sheer numbers, in numerical numbers, because of the makeup of America, you know, and so we still, same thing with welfare. Welfare was, welfare queens as Black women, it wasn't correct. There were more numerical whites on welfare, white females on welfare, but it was the Black female, and I think we don't truly like understand we don't understand what's really going on to say, we're not really pinpointing the truth beyond it. I don't know if I'm making any sense. It's just a very frustrating situation because
well, there's a bunch of points in there that I'm not gonna be able to touch them all, but it sounds like there's a frustration about the symbolic economy of what these things, I mean, it sounds like what I said earlier about, it's not about the drug, it's about who's assumed to be using it, kind of falls under some of your observations, that it doesn't, if the social, you know, if the social perception is, oh, you know, it's Black men who are doing crimes, you know, whether or not that's numerically correct doesn't matter, because that's what drives policy. And I think it's the same thing. I mean, from my perspective, there's lots of substances that got criminalized simply because they were associated with either, you know, usually Black people or Latino people. Then, you know, the opium in the 19th century was against Chinese in the Western states. Whereas we had white people using similar substances or ones that might have been even more dangerous, and they, you know, completely not subject to legal sanctions, sometimes just completely decriminalized. I mean, is that kind of what you're going at? That, I mean, there's this perception, or?
I understand to some degree, like, perception is reality, but just, I struggle with this with my students, and even when I was an undergrad, I remember my first intro to sociology class hearing that, you know, welfare was predominantly white, like welfare was, and I was shocked. I was like, what? Like, I didn't know that, and I felt so ignorant, because all the images that I saw was in all the media hype about welfare, and then its dismantlement was actually based on Black females, but then it was an attack on the Black family, and, you know, all of these things, crack baby, all of these myths, right? So I challenge us as scientists to disentangle statistics and even disproportionate percentages. I mean, if you look at any group, Blacks, you know, we're using these artificial racial categories, but if you just look at them, right, everybody has a leading cause of death, or, you know, everybody's dying of something, right? The top 3 causes of death, like heart disease, stroke, cancer. And I think when we just look at a particular issue and we say, this is a Black issue, this is yes, certain groups can be affected, but for some reason, when it comes to African Americans, it's like we become the label of all these different things that we don't actually fit the label of it. You know, it just...
Yeah, well, I mean, in a lot of ways...
Like we become the face of things that we're not really the face of. We are more like, it's a disproportionate percentage, but the face of it, like in sheer numbers, if we put all the people in the room,
that have the issue, like, it's not the face, but we become the face, and by becoming the face and taking it on and saying, like, my students think that African Americans are more likely to just die of everything, like cancer, heart, like anything I know, they're like, yeah, we just die of.
I mean, kind of, sort of. I
Everything
mean, it's like
but
a
it's
lot
not.
of, yeah, a lot of.
Strategy. I mean, like, it's not. It doesn't have. I feel like it
But
doesn't
when we
have to be
believe,
real.
what I'm saying is we believe it though. We believe that in sheer when we think in sheer numbers, 13% of the population has now trumped the 70% and everybody else. And then now we become the face of everything that is considered to be negative.
And
It's
that's
just
part
like
of the.
not.
That's part of the.
But I also think it's part of our misunderstanding of numbers versus proportions.
Right.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't be the majority of something because we're not the majority of the population of this country. However, if we're disproportionately represented, then that is problematic. And so what happens is, let's say we're talking about women receiving social support services, we are disproportionately represented, but because writ large the United States population doesn't understand the difference between that and basic numbers, people say, well, most of the women on welfare are black. No. We're disproportionately represented given our size in the population, but we are not most of the women. And I
Isn't it more?
I don't think we do well with numbers and stats in this country.
I'm sorry, but isn't it more than that? Isn't it more? I think that the symbolic economy of the economy of symbols
Right.
is sort of what you're getting at. Is that it's not just that we're disproportionately represented. Is that we're disproportionately presented as the symbol for this thing or that. And this is, then we become the performance of that particular thing, and not just, regardless of what the true number is, you as an African American person grow up believing this performance just as much as the white American who grows up believing it. And so you encounter one another in a classroom. Yes? You encounter one another in a classroom in the midst of this misrepresentation, but clearly put out as a particular kind of cultural performance to say that this is what we want the society to know. Yes,
But I think
it's
it
not true,
goes back
but
to
this
what
is
you
what
were
we want the
saying
society to know.
about the story
This
we
is what we
tell.
want the society to believe. This is what we want you to understand as yourself, take on, and grow up into. Yes? And so then you have a whole other thing that's latched onto policy, that's latched onto statistics, that's latched onto this, is the construction of a symbolic epistemology that, granted, doesn't have statistical truth, but carries cultural, a particular kind of cultural value. Does that make sense?
I think, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I'm not sure I hear you all disagreeing, in fact.
No, we're on the same page.
Oh, okay, okay, all right, that's what I thought. Because I was trying to figure out, are they debating here? Because maybe I'm just not figuring out
I
the,
just wanted to go back to
yeah.
what you said about the story we tell about the numbers. So if we are disproportionately represented, it's because of some moral failing. If black women are receiving social support services, it's because they're lazy and sexually irresponsible. Not because perhaps they tried to start a family in a factory town and the factory went under and these women are just doing the best that they can. We don't get the structural backstory in the same way. There is no linkage to a long history of discrimination. It's look at these horribly lazy people sucking off the teat of the government. It's not look at all the ways in which they've been failed for generations and how this is the product of that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ugliness of it. That's the ugliness of the symbol,
Yeah.
is that the whole story is not told.
In the same way that a white male can kill people and then get off on affluenza.
Or because he was bullied and he was lonely and he had depression.
Yeah.
We don't get that bad story.
No.
An athlete.
And
had an elite college.
Right. Exactly. But at least he was a good swimmer.
Yeah, exactly.
I think
This is something you already pointed out and explained in the aspect of the production of knowledge, the issue in your piece on the plague this time.
yeah.
I really think that it is about the allegory and what this word stands for and the other systems of economic violence or political economy and that knowledge economy that is produced out of these contradictions of capital. I really love that very much and I think it
Thank you.
probably answers some of these misrepresentations that you are trying to touch on.
Well, we will explore those and many more issues over the next 4 days. I do not want to get in trouble because we're significantly past the end of my time and there are snacks waiting for us. Oh, where are they? Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.